As winding alleys of the city were the only home Marshall knew, his parents, driven by unknown circumstances, had abandoned the little boy when he was just over a year old. He still held, albeit vaguely, the scent of that last hug before being left to his own fate. As a consequence, life led him to the steps of the House of Hope, an orphanage with peeling walls and windows that creaked in the wind. Inside there, Marshall grew like a solitary flower in the midst of a desert. He was introspective, with eyes that reflected the pain of a young soul that had already faced much. "Why doesn't anyone want me?" he whispered once, looking at his reflection in the fogged window of the dormitory. His voice rarely echoed through the corridors, but when it did, it was always with such cutting frankness that the words seemed like blades. "You have no right to treat me like this," he said once, looking directly into the eyes of Mrs. Granger, the caregiver who had a reputation for being stern. After seeing her unjustly scolding one of the younger kids, in retaliation, Marshall's raw honesty found him receiving more than cruel words in return. Many times, the marks on his body bore witness to the price his integrity demanded. When the time finally came to leave the orphanage, Marshall, with a backpack on his back and dreams in his heart, headed for the metropolis. He embraced the challenge, studied diligently, got his driver's license, and rented a small apartment in the city center with a view of a tangle of urban lights and sounds. His new job as a taxi driver gave him freedom, but life still tested his integrity. Marshall, his manager, grumbled one day, a burly man with a cigar permanently hanging from his lips, "I don't like your attitude, but I can't deny that you're the best at what you do." Even facing the indifference and injustice of his boss, Marshall moved forward, his moral compass always pointing north, always in pursuit of what was right. The atmosphere was charged and heavy as raindrops fell from the sky with a peculiar fury. Marshall was inside his taxi, and the windshield wipers moved frantically, trying to keep up with the relentless rhythm of the rain. A gentle melody played on the radio, contrasting with the cacophony of honks and sirens from the miles-long traffic jam. The clock on the dashboard marked every second, every minute, making his anxiety more palpable. He glanced out the window, trying to identify the end of the congestion. A customer awaited his arrival, and minutes of delay could affect his reputation. Why now, of all times? Marshall muttered impatiently, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. The red glow of brake lights from the cars ahead reflected on his face, casting a somber light upon him. In this moment of forced introspection, a wave of loneliness washed over him, causing him to question his choices and the path he had taken. Driven by a sudden desire to escape, he sharply turned the steering wheel, entering a narrow and dimly lit alleyway, which he hoped might be an exit from the traffic jam. As he maneuvered the taxi through the puddles formed by the rain, a silhouette suddenly appeared in front of his headlights. Marshall hit the brakes, his heart racing, and the taxi skidded precariously, stopping just inches away from a young woman who looked as terrified as he felt. Taking a deep breath, Marshall got out of the car, rain soaking his shirt within seconds. "Are you crazy? You could have been run over," he exclaimed, his voice elevated by fear and adrenaline. That's when he noticed the young woman held her prominently pregnant belly with one hand, clearly with child. Her pale face contrasted with the wet hair clinging to her forehead. Struggling to control his emotions, Marshall continued, "I'm sorry for shouting, but what are you doing running in this rain?" She, with teary eyes, slid towards the curb, hugging her belly, and sobbed, I just wanted to find shelter." Seeing her so vulnerable, Marshall felt a tightness in his chest. He reached towards the back door of his taxi and said with a softer tone, "Get in. Let's find a dry place for you. It's not good to be out like this in the rain." The rain continued to fall outside the taxi, but inside, the atmosphere began to shift. Marshall, sensing the need to break the palpable silence, adjusted his rearview mirror, stole a glance at her, and said with a playful tone and a wry smile, "Well, since we're here together, allow me to make the introductions. I'm Marshall, and when I'm not almost running people over in alleys, I'm a taxi driver." Camille, surprised by Marshall's relaxed tone, smiled timidly, wiping the last tears from her eyes. "Sorry for the dramatic entrance," she began, taking a deep breath. "My name is Camille, and just to clarify a little detail, I'm an ex-convict." Marshall's eyes widened slightly, but he tried not to appear shocked. He raised an eyebrow, curious. "Really? I would have never guessed." With a somewhat resigned smile, she replied, "Yeah, women also face their own battles behind bars. But don't judge me, everyone has their story." He nodded thoughtfully. "I believe that. And from the looks of it, life is giving you a second chance with this little one here," he said gently, pointing to Camille's belly. When prompted, she caressed her belly and said softly, "I'm in my 7th month. It's a boy." The atmosphere inside the car turned introspective, and Marshall, looking at the road ahead, confessed in a melancholic tone, "I've never known the blessing of having a family. No wife, no kids. Often feels like I'm wandering alone in this vast world." Camille looked at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of sympathy and determination. "Life is unpredictable, Marshall, but one thing I can tell you, your kindness and empathy shine through, and that, my friend, is more valuable than you realize." As they approached a modest neighborhood, Camille provided Marshall with an address, and noticing his hesitation to start the meter, she tried to reassure him, "I'll pay for the ride. I have some money saved up." He looked at her through the mirror with a warm smile. "Don't worry about that. Today's on me." Marshall's face was a mosaic of confusion and surprise. It was incomprehensible to him that an ex-convict, clearly pregnant, could have financial resources. Memories of clients he had transported in the past, promising to return with payment and disappearing into the shadows, flashed through his mind like a fast-forward film. Seeing his skeptical expression, Camille gave him a determined look and stated, "Marshall, I may have spent some time behind bars, but that doesn't mean I'm broke. In fact, I have a sum saved up in the bank. I just need to make a withdrawal." He looked at her, still doubting. "I don't want to cause trouble for you. I'm just trying to help." Camille laughed. "You're a kind soul, and I appreciate that. But I promise to pay you, and I'll keep that promise." As the taxi stopped in front of the imposing bank building, Marshall's eyes widened. That wasn't just any institution, it was one of the most renowned in the city. Trying to mask his discomfort with humor, he joked, "Look, I really hope you're not planning any crazy heist in there. Being an accomplice isn't in my plans for today." Camille rolled her eyes and chuckled, "Relax, Marshall. I'm just going to make a withdrawal. Nothing dramatic." Marshall watched as she entered the bank, his heart beating a little faster. Each minute seemed to stretch, and a part of him feared hearing the shrill sound of sirens, expecting the abrupt arrival of police vehicles. Shadows of Camille's past cast doubts in his mind. Glancing at the clock, he realized he was considerably late for his next customer. He hoped that, regardless of what happened next, he wouldn't receive a complaint for this unexpected ride. By the end of the shift, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot, Marshall noticed a group of his coworkers gathered in a corner. They were trying to contain their laughter, throwing furtive glances his way. Before he could approach and understand what was happening, his manager's voice interrupted him, summoning him to the office. Marshall could feel the weight of curious eyes on him as he walked. Entering the office, the manager, a burly man with a thick mustache and an expression of barely contained glee, pointed to a chair in front of his desk. "Have a seat, Marshall." The room was filled with a heavy silence, and Marshall hesitated, sensing that something was amiss. "What happened, sir?" The manager crossed his fingers on the desk and said, leaning forward, "You know, Marshall, all our cars have trackers. We're always aware of where our vehicles are." He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes fixed on Marshall. "Especially when they make unscheduled stops at banks." Marshall swallowed hard, feeling cold sweat forming on his forehead. I can explain, sir. It was an unforeseen situation. A client needed to make a quick withdrawal. The manager cut him off with a dismissive wave of his hand. I'm not interested in your explanations. However, I am interested in maintaining the integrity and efficiency of our company. Marshall, expecting a reprimand, mentally prepared himself to apologize. However, what came next caught him completely off guard. The manager leaned back in his chair and, with a satisfied smile, announced, "Marshall, considering your recent lapses in conduct, you're fired." Marshall was stunned, the reality of the situation taking a while to sink in. He had been caught off guard, and now he faced an uncertain future. Lost in somber thoughts, Marshall sat at the bus stop, his back hunched, and his eyes fixed on the ground. The sounds of the city around him seemed distant, like a constant buzz. The humiliation of his dismissal was still fresh in his mind. But soon, his attention shifted to the young woman who had crossed his path that day, Camille. How would she be now? What would she have done after leaving the bank? The night was beginning to settle in as he walked slowly towards his apartment. The soft lights from nearby building windows illuminated the path. When he was interrupted by a firm knock on his door, he was used to occasional visits from his gossipy neighbor, always eager to share the latest news. Prepared for a casual conversation, he opened the door. However, instead of the familiar face of his neighbor, he was greeted by the unexpected gaze of Camille. Her eyes were lit by the corridor lights, and she had a smile that was half shy, half confident. "Hey," she exclaimed, a touch of hesitation in her voice. "I bet you weren't expecting to see me. It wasn't easy to track you down, you know." Dazed, Marshall took a step back, blinking in surprise. "Camille, why are you going to invite me in, or are we going to stand out here chatting?" she teased, looking around. Recovering from the initial shock, Marshall stepped aside, allowing her to enter. Of course. Come in." As they settled down, the aroma of a simple meal began to fill the room. During dinner, the weight of the past hours seemed to have dissipated for Marshall. He spoke openly about his recent dismissal, reliving painful memories of his childhood in the orphanage, venting about life's injustices. Camille listened attentively, her gaze understanding and deep. When Marshall finished, Camille picked up her glass and said, "Now it's my turn to share, but I warn you, it's a long journey." Marshall smiled, leaning back in his chair, his curiosity piqued. "Well, I just lost my job and have the whole day free tomorrow, so I have all the time in the world." Seated at Marshall's table under the soft glow of candles, Camille took a deep breath, gathering strength to recount a past that still hurt. Her eyes were distant yet determined. "When my mother passed away, my world crumbled," she began, her voice gentle. "My father was the family pillar, always centered, a hugely successful businessman. But his grief over losing my mother made him seek solace quickly. Not long after, he introduced Christina, his new fiancée. She was elegant and knew how to charm people, but something about her unsettled me." Camille ran her fingers along the rim of her glass, as if reliving those moments. "I tried to talk to my father, asked him to reconsider, to wait longer. I felt he was rushing things, but he was inflexible. 'She fills the void your mother left,' he would tell me. I poured myself into my business even more, a company I have built from scratch and was immensely proud of. It was my escape, my sanctuary. Then one day, my father asked me for a favor, to hire Richard, Christina's son. I did it out of consideration for my father, but it was the worst decision I ever made." Camille's eyes flamed with intensity as she remembered. Richard was cunning. He was smiling and polite in front of me, but behind my back, he started plotting my downfall, fake documents, accusations. And before I could defend myself, I was accused and arrested. Marshall's voice was soft and empathetic. "I'm so sorry, Camille. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been for you." She continued, swallowing the sadness. But the hardest blow came later. During my time behind bars, I received news of my father's sudden death. And in a cruel twist, I found out that Richard and Christina had taken over my company. Marshall, impressed, could only shake his head in disbelief, admiring Camille's strength and determination. Marshall watched Camille, his eyes drawn to her prominent belly. He hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of him. "And what about this?" he asked softly, pointing to her abdomen. Camille looked down, caressing her belly with a mixture of tenderness and melancholy. "This part of the story," she began, pausing to take a deep breath, "might be the most complicated chapter of my life. In my desperation to get out of prison, to fight for what's rightfully mine, and understand what really happened to my father, I had to make difficult choices." She bit her lower lip, looking at Marshall, her eyes a whirlwind of emotions. "My father was a bull, strong, vibrant. I would never imagine he would just pass away like that. I always felt deep down that Christina was behind it. So, in prison, I saw an opportunity in an unlikely figure, the warden. He had influence, and I needed a way out. We got close, and, well, I got more involved than I intended." Her eyes glistened with restrained tears. "And now I'm expecting twins. Despite everything, I want to give them a chance. I want them to know love and happiness." Marshall, recalling the hardships of his own childhood, felt a surge of compassion for her. "Camille, I would never judge your decisions. We all have our paths and struggles." He moved closer and enveloped her in a tight, comforting hug. "You're not alone in this." As they pulled away from the embrace, the night had fully enveloped the city. "Let me prepare the guest room for you," Marshall offered, wanting to ensure she felt welcomed and cared for. Camille nodded, grateful, and Marshall made sure she was comfortable before retiring to the couch, thoughtful about the unexpected twists life could bring. The morning sun sneaked through the curtain slits, casting a golden light onto Camille's skin. She was awakened by the comforting and alluring aroma of homemade food. Rubbing her eyes, she slowly sat up, wrapping herself in the sheet. The smell was so delightful, it seemed to caress her nostrils, guiding her towards the source. Exiting the room, she observed Marshall in the kitchen, an apron tied around his waist and his hair slightly tousled, focused on flipping a pancake in the pan. Noticing her, he smiled, his eyes radiating warmth that complemented the aroma filling the room. "Good morning. Hope you're hungry." "Decided to make pancakes with fruit syrup. They're the best for a fresh start," he said, his voice gentle and welcoming. She smiled, her stomach rumbling in approval. "Sounds amazing, Marshall." "Thank you." As they savored the fluffy golden pancakes, the comfortable silence was interrupted when Camille voiced her concern. "Marshall, I'm at a crossroads. I'm about to give birth, and I still have a mountain of challenges ahead to reclaim what's mine and expose that wicked duo." Setting down his fork, Marshall looked deeply into Camille's eyes, determined. "We'll figure this out together. I know an excellent private investigator and a lawyer who's not afraid to take on the corporate sharks." She nodded, tears in her eyes, moved by the solidarity. "I don't know how to thank you, Marshall." He simply smiled. "We already started with a good breakfast. Let's take it one step at a time." On a sunny afternoon, as Marshall was reviewing some documents from the investigator, his phone buzzed frantically. Seeing Camille's name flashing on the screen, he answered immediately, sensing the urgency in her voice. "Marshall, I think it's happening. The contractions have started," she exclaimed, trying to control her breathing. Rushing to the hospital, he felt his heart race, fearing for Camille's and the baby's safety. But upon arrival, the doctors reassured him, informing that it was a false alarm. Nonetheless, they decided to keep Camille under observation as a precaution. Sitting by her side, holding her hand, Marshall looked deeply into her eyes and felt a surge of emotion. It was evident how much he had grown attached to her and the little beings growing in her belly. In the silence of that hospital room, he made a bold decision. Camille, I've realized life is unpredictable. I want to be by your side and our children's side every day. Will you marry me? He asked nervously. Camille, surprised yet with eyes shining with emotion, nodded. Yes, Marshall. Yes. As the two prepared for a new phase of their lives, the investigator and lawyer were diligently working to unravel the mystery of betrayal and fraud. In a few days, they presented an irrefutable set of evidence. Confronted, Richard, frightened, quickly pointed the finger at his mother, Christina, while the suspicious death of Camille's father remained a mystery. The evidence of the fraud was undeniable. In a tense trial, Christina was convicted for her illicit actions, while Richard, attempting to minimize his involvement, received a lighter conditional sentence. In the gentle glow of a golden sunset, Camille brought two healthy boys into the world. Their first cries filled the room with joy and hope. As the three finally crossed the threshold of their home, the reality of a future as a united family began to settle in. The ambience was filled with the joy of birth, but practical needs also arose. Determined to start anew, the couple decided to get married. With the assistance of the money left by Camille's father, a cozy home with a front garden and a modern family car quickly became part of their lives. However, Marshall, with a thoughtful look, often found himself gazing out the window. He felt the weight of responsibilities looming ahead, especially having left his previous job to provide full support to Camille. One night, while cradling one of the boys, he confessed, "Camille, now there are 4 of us. I'm afraid of the future. I quit my job, and with 2 kids to care for, I don't know if I'll be able to give them everything they deserve." Camille, understanding the depth of Marshall's worry, walked over to him, holding the other baby in her arms. Their eyes met, and she smiled reassuringly. "Marshall, remember that company my father started and that was almost destroyed by Christina and Richard? You've been by my side, fighting to reclaim it, piece by piece. It's not just mine, it's ours. Together, we'll rebuild it and make it thrive, just like our family." He embraced her with the babies between them, feeling the warmth of the hug and the security of her words. "Together, we're stronger," he repeated, vowing to work tirelessly for his family's future. Thank you for joining us today on Deep Stories. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next video.